Welcome to the Parableman podcast. My name is Jeremy Pierce. I am here today with a guest, George Yancey, who is a sociology professor at Baylor University and has authored a number of works related to race issues. And so we're going to talk about some of that today. I have two of your books, George. I have the version of your arguments that you wrote for the Christian population, Christian audience, which I have not read yet. And I have your book that you co-authored with Michael Emerson, which is about the same material roughly, but designed for a more or a broader audience and probably aimed at an introductory level college class from what it seemed to me. And so that's my familiarity with that, other than stuff that you've done online.
Mm-hmm.
And you've obviously done a lot more writing on this in the last few months since George Floyd and all of that happened. And my understanding is that you've just completed another book, or you're about to complete another book?
Yeah, I sent the manuscript in to university, and university quasi treats it like an academic book in that they'll send out to reviewers. Right. And so I'll get comments back, and then I'll react to the comments. But I've signed a contract, so the book will get published unless
so there's a good amount of stuff still to happen.
Unless I get canceled in between time or something like that. So
right. So,
but I've been staying away from the women, so I don't think that'll be a problem.
So it'll probably be another year or so before that appears, something like that.
What?
It'll probably be about another year before it appears, that kind of thing.
That's my guess. My guess is it's either be late this year, but they probably want to bring it in with the spring stuff. That's my thinking.
So my general take on your approach is, you can correct me if I'm getting any of the details a little bit off, but you are trying to find a middle ground between what some people call the colorblind approach and what some people call anti-racism.
Yeah.
And that's a specialized definition of the term anti-racism. I think it's important to say there are people who hear that word and they think you're opposed to racism, but that's not what you mean when you say anti-racism. And that's not what a lot of people who are race activists, academics working on race issues mean by anti-racism. So can you give a quick explanation of those two views that you're trying to find a middle ground between?
I guess I think less middle ground and more something that's distinctive from both of them. But I get what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, colorblindness is probably pretty easy to explain. It just means you ignore race. That the idea that if we ignore race, then we'll be able to overcome racism. And so that's pretty straightforward. Anti-racism, as you said, I hear people say, how could you critique anti-racism? Who could be pro-racism? Who could be for racism? But then if you read the literature, the anti-racists themselves say, being anti-racist is not just being against racism. I mean, Kennedy's really famous for that, right? I mean, Kennedy says, there's no such thing as being, what's he say? There's no such thing as being non-racist.
Non-racist.
So you're either you're pro-racist or you're anti-racist. And so, because I can see some people colorblind say, well, I'm anti-racist, I don't like racism. But of course, that's not what it's meant. And so I guess, a very quick and dirty definition, and one that obviously lacks nuance, is that to be anti-racist is a very proactive approach towards dealing with racism and searching it out and confronting it, be it personal, be it institutional, be it structural, systematic, whatever form it takes. And so that's not nearly as complete of a definition as one should have, but it'll work for right now.
Okay. So I imagine that people in those two groups would both try to push back against that characterization. So I can imagine, I mean, when I've engaged with people who self-ascribe the name colorblind to themselves,
Yeah.
and you say, well, you're ignoring race, they really don't like being characterized that way.
Yeah.
So why would you think that's an accurate characterization of it?
Well, I mean, when I talk to people who are colorblind, they basically say, why are you paying attention to race? So to me, that's ignoring race. And you know, the
Okay.
example that I give all the time, well, not all the time since it's happened, was when I post on Facebook, you know, just asking people on how they're raising their, you know, because I have 3 boys of color. So I just basically asked, you know, what are y'all doing to sort of prepare them for racial issues? And I got a lot of people who said, well, why are you even bringing up race as far as why you're trying to raise your boys? So to me, that is practically, you're telling me I should ignore race in raising my own boys. So what, you know, maybe they don't like the word ignore. You know, maybe they would like to think that they downplay the importance of race. You know, maybe they feel that's more accurate. But you're telling people don't bring race into the conversation, then you are ignoring race. So, you know, that's how I would see it. Uh, the anti-racism definition, I admit, you know, what I'm given is lacks the complete nuance of what anti-racism is. But you know, we're just, you know,
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the colorblind definition you gave, there's some people who actually say explicitly that, and I think you're right about that. They'll say, yeah, we should. I mean, racial categories are fictional. There's no scientific basis for them, and therefore we should not pay any attention to them whatsoever.
yeah,
I think there's a more moderate approach that sometimes gets called colorblind, where they'll describe their view as we should just. I mean, yeah, we can recognize that people have different racial tags, if you will, that our society assigns to them, but we should move ourselves away from thinking in those terms.
yeah,
And it's sort of they're a little bit more gradualist about it, I guess. Whereas you have those who just completely want to stop doing it right now.
mm-hmm.
And I think both of those groups do exist. I think both of them have called themselves colorblind.
Yeah,
Like they don't like affirmative action, the more moderate view. They don't like
right,
affirmative action. They don't like hate crime laws and things like that because you're drawing attention to these negative categories.
right,
So, in a sense, they'll talk about it. They're not completely ignoring it, but they're trying to move away from it in a
yeah.
pretty concerted way. Yeah.
I
So,
guess, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with Weber's concept of the ideal type, or not, but I mean, you know, I guess you know, I guess when you discuss things like this, because, you know, there's always gradations and variations within any sort of ideology. And so Weber talks about an ideal type where you sort of use it so that you can start talking about theoretically what this means.
right.
And so, you know, when I talk about colorblindness and anti-racism, uh, and I'm probably a little bit more wary about this. I talk about anti-racism because, you know, like even the difference to say between Kendi and Deangelo on whether or not blacks can be racist. There's all sorts of people who take certain elements of it and then add their own personal taste to it. And so if you describe anti-racism, there's going to be some people say, well, that's not me, even though I'm anti-racist. And so you have to, but all this to say is, you know, yeah, I use ideal types because I think they're very useful for helping us to see what these ideologies say, what they get right, what they get wrong, and to move on from there. Acknowledging, you know, I fully acknowledge that, you know, that there are people who say, well, I would describe myself kind of this way, but you're not completely describing me. But that's just basically,
Right.
you know, what can you do? There's 300 million people in the United States. You can't find an ideology that's going to capture significant chunks of them. Everyone's going to say, yes, I agree.
But you can find general tendencies that tend
Right,
to be
yeah.
often together, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So, so for anti-racism, then, obviously the definition that you're giving is something that doesn't sound that extreme. Where
Yeah,
you're just saying, well, they give it a concerted attention. They're going to actually pay attention and work hard to
yeah.
try to do right. What are the particular things about it that I mean, I think from what you said already about colorblindness, the fact that they're ignoring race is what you have trouble with. What is it about anti-racism that you have trouble with?
Well, I think the implications of how anti-racism is done is problematic, and I would, you know, uh, practically speaking, what happens is when you look for race everywhere, you find racism everywhere, and you find racism as the issue everywhere, and so. Uh, so I think that's the first issue is that I think reality is much more complex and nuanced than that. Does racism explain certain racial differences? Clearly, there's an element of that, but it's not the only thing that does that. People don't want to. I'll just be honest. We have problems in our African American community when it comes to education. There's an oppositional culture that's real, and people say, well, let's blame the victim. But I've experienced that, and I've had to fight through that in order to get my education. And so you can say blame the victim, but it's also just part of the reality of life. And so so there's that. So that just on that definition, that's the problem. But then when you get to the nuts and bolts of how anti-racism is done, and I didn't. And I would say that probably 95% of the anti-racists would if they don't personally agree with this, would live this out. One of the components in anti-racism that's not self-evident from the definition I gave is sort of a denigration of any opinions by European Americans. And to the point where I think it is legitimate for a white person to feel like if they're in an anti-racism environment, that they have no say, that they're not supposed to speak up for anything that they believe that does not vary from whatever anti-racism ideas that's out there at the time. Now, can I say that every single racist person has that? Probably not, but I would, from reading their literature and from talking to them and being, hearing them talk about it, that is also a component of anti-racism. The sort of denigration of anything that a white person has to say. A common saying that I know you've read about is ending whiteness. Well, what does that mean? What ending whiteness means. Now, I know that what some people will say is is this genocide? Do you want to kill white people? And of course, that's not what it means.
Yeah, that's totally getting it wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But does it not also mean, at least to some degree, that it's sort of ending European American culture? Because when I hear people talk about ending whiteness, and they may not say this directly, and I get that, but this is a pattern that I've just seen. They put all these attributes that they perceive as being negative or not that great, and they put it on. It's almost like a sacrificial lamb. They put it on white culture, and then let's kill the culture. That illustration just came to me. I know I was going to talk. Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, I think there's two,
but yeah, that's what was it, Smithsonian Museum? Was that the one that did all that chart with this is what whiteness is? And people were going, really? So that's a tendency that I just see within anti-racism, which basically inhibits useful conversations that we could have. Because if people are being told, we're ending whiteness and you really don't have a place to say anything unless you agree with us, that makes it hard to have conversations.
So I think there's really two levels of what's going on here. One is sort of the official statement of the view. And the official statement of the view seems to me to be, hey, here's this thing that can be toxic. It can be demeaning to people of color. It can be excluding them and marginalizing them in various ways. Let's call it whiteness, right? And then they'll say that whiteness is at the very foundation of a lot of society, because a lot of the things that we developed were developed with slavery in mind and with later things after slavery was gone that perpetuate the disparities and the stereotypes and the biases that are there. And I think if you put it that way, it sounds entirely unproblematic to me to say that there are these things that are out there that work that way. And if you want to use the word whiteness for that, that's a little, it's certainly unclear because people are not going to hear it the way it's intended.
Yeah.
But then when you see what they start, the second level is when you see what they start applying it to, they just start applying it to everything. And, and everything is whiteness, and things that are good, they'll be calling whiteness, and then whiteness is a dirty word. So there, I mean, there's nothing wrong with logical argument. That's not
right. Yeah.
That's not right. There's nothing wrong with, yeah, I totally understand the need to find ways for kids to learn math. If they're from a community that hasn't had the same level of educational standards, there might be better ways to teach them. But then calling the traditional ways white and acting as if they're bad because they're white seems to me to be misdiagnosing the problem. Right? And I'm all for exploring ways to educate kids better. But it seems like they're making it something it's not. Or at least they're giving the impression to people who don't know what they mean that they're meaning something that they don't.
Yeah.
And in my experience, if you try to confront someone about that, they either say that you're just perpetuating the racist system, or they say that you don't understand. If you're white, they say you don't understand it because you're white, or they explain, hey, I don't mean it that way. I don't actually mean it that way. But then when you see how much stuff they're actually applying to, it makes it seem like they really do mean it that way. That's the thing. When there's their official view, and they don't mean it that way in their official view. But then when you see all the things they're actually including in it, you got to wonder. With some of the people who are doing this anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's a matter of what people say and what they actually do. I look at what they actually do, not just what they say. Now, obviously, when I try to represent someone in my research and they say they're doing something, and then I say, okay, this is what they say they're doing. But then you actually have to report what they do as well. That they have these sort of arguments. I remember actually, just thinking back in grad school, and I remember that we were being taught about the culture of indigenous people and things like that. And I remember thinking, every time we're taught about the culture of indigenous people, it seems that these sort of liberal progressive values are placed on it. So the indigenous people, they're very environmentally sound. They're very gender egalitarian. They're very, I was thinking, that just does not comport with reality to me.
Right.
That indigenous people were very accepting of LGBTQ people. And I just, I'm sure there were some examples of that throughout. There's hundreds and not thousands of Native American groups, so you can find examples to support your point. But that just did not seem right to me, and that's where I first got the notion that that the good things that was being seen by the subculture I was in was being placed on marginalized people's culture, and the bad things were being placed on European American culture. Now, I didn't really have the words to articulate at the time.
Yeah.
But it, just because I went to grad school, I don't know about you, I went to grad school kind of, I want to find truth, and this is science, and we're going to test everything, and we're going to put our biases aside and find truth, and I quickly learned how foolish it was to believe that. And that's one of the things that came to my mind is like, these people are not really interested in finding truth, they're interested in pushing their narrative.
Right.
And this is the problem with the way this is used, among other problems. I mean, there's other problems with the way the term is used. But to me, that's part of the problem is that, it's the push of a narrative and not a helpful narrative, from my point of view.
But you have no problem with pointing to, you don't mind the term systemic racism.
No.
No problem with that. So when you criticize this, it's not because you're suspicious that there are systemic problems related to race. It's not that you think the things they're pointing to are, I mean, some of them might go too far, some of them might be misidentifying the problem, but there really is a need to identify and address some of these problems that they're calling whiteness. It's not because you think that the
Yeah, it's not because I don't believe institutional racism doesn't exist or anything
Right.
like that. And I would, I tell people, the value of an anti-racist approach is sometimes we see problems that we may have missed. Do they go overboard and see problems everywhere? Yes. But sometimes, what they point out is actually something that's real.
Right.
And a couple of examples I just would give is that, I think something white privilege is a reality. I think that there is something called white privilege that is out there that we would not normally perhaps notice if we hadn't had an anti-racist approach. On the other hand, I think the whole thing of microaggressions is a bunch of crap. You know, you know, if you could find a way of measuring it for me and showing and operationalizing it so that it's like, okay, this is something that is solid. Like you can kind of do that with privilege. I mean, it's not the easiest thing to do, but you can actually concretely make the argument. And you might be able to, the privilege of when you're pulled over, you don't have to worry about if you're pulled over by being black. Well, there's actually research that shows that driving while black is a real thing.
Right.
And that's not just something that we just made up in our heads, that if you're black, you're more likely to be pulled over. And so if you're considering that while being pulled over, you're actually connected to reality. On the other hand, microaggressions is just like, my feelings hurt a little bit. You said America was a good place. I mean, I can't take that seriously.
Well,
So sometimes they go overboard with something like microaggressions, but then other times the privilege to actually latch on to something that's real. And so there's value in that. You just have to, have to learn how to discern what's useful and what's not.
So some of the things that people call microaggressions, they're just pointing out ways that you can like insult someone a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Even though you feel like you're not.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with pointing that out. I think that's a really good thing to do, to say, hey, look, if you tell someone who's an Asian American and ask them where they're from, and they say California, and you think that's the wrong answer because they're from China, even though their parents came from China, they never lived there in their life, right? There is something insulting about that. I don't.
Yeah, that's rude.
That kind of thing that people call microaggressions is worth pointing to. So the part of it that you're questioning is not that, right?
Right. Yeah. To me, a lot of that could just be covered in rudeness. I mean, that could be like if I asked you where you're from, and you say Brooklyn, and I said, no, you have a Southern accent. You're not really from Brooklyn. I'm sort of insulting you because you're telling me about yourself, and I'm saying you don't know you.
Right.
That's insulting. So yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes microaggressions lands on something that truly is rude or insulting. Yeah, but it
can fall along race lines. It can fall along race lines. But what you're questioning is how much value the recognition of those tendencies can have in connecting with real life outcomes, right?
Right. Yeah, I would need to see. I mean, you know me. I want to see the research on that. Yeah. Show me some research that shows. Show me research that shows that there's uniqueness in the rudeness based on race as opposed to other groups. I want to see that research, and then you can talk to me about, are there microaggressions? Are there certain ways? But if all you're going to say is, we don't like when people say these things. All right. Well, sometimes, what people may be saying may be rude. Sometimes you just may not like it just because you disagree with them. And I'm sorry, I mean, that's a society. People disagree with me all the time, Yeah. That's life.
Yeah, and I think there's a tendency among some of the anti-racism advocates to take, I mean, it feels to me like it's the equivalent of when American Christians will say they're persecuted because someone made fun of them.
Right.
When there are people in the world who are being put in prison or executed for their faith, right?
Right, yeah.
The use of the word persecution there seems like it's heavily exaggerated. Now, I mean, is there a sense in which that's persecution? I guess so. I mean,
yeah.
And I mean, Jesus told his followers, he told his disciples, the world isn't going to like you because it doesn't like me.
Yeah.
And people who don't believe in Jesus don't like some of the things that Christians do and say. And yes, that's going to include being made fun of. But there's a degree thing here of seriousness. And I mean, I would be equally willing to criticize some of the use of the term oppressive or oppression that comes from the left for the same reason. Microaggressions are treated as an oppression.
Yeah.
They are treated as when there are people who are literally being killed because of their ethnic group in some parts of the world. Now there is the police issue in the United States. There's police violence. Are Black people being killed at a disproportionate rate compared with white people by the police?
Yeah.
It seems like the evidence is that is true, but that it's also
not at the levels that we normally think of
right,
oppression. Yeah.
right,
So,
not at the same level as the kinds of oppression that have occurred where when it's deliberate and organized. Like,
and this is not radical Muslims lining up a bunch of Christians and beheading them.
Right, right.
There's different. It's kind of funny what you said about persecution, because I actually did a blog, because even though I've done research on anti-Christian discrimination, I don't like Christians, American Christians, talking about being persecuted. And so I did a blog, and my intention was to do this blog and to start off with the definition of persecution and say, folks, is this really what you're suffering? Well, I looked at the field definition, and I forget the exact words, but it's something like belittling or something like that. I said, actually, that definition actually fits, but it's such a wide definition that it would fit for almost any group. Almost any group can claim, I mean, what group is not ridiculed by someone in our society? Right. So I said, okay, you got me. By definition, you are persecuted, but the way we use that term doesn't apply to what you're. So you create an image that's not real, even though I had to admit technically, by this definition, because it can apply to anyone, of course, then it can apply to you as well. So it's kind of interesting that when I wrote that blog, trying to disabuse Christians of the notion of persecution, and then having to admit, well, by definition, because anyone can be persecuted, anyone can be belittled. You are definitely belittled. So it fits in that sort of sense. But I totally get what you're coming from on the persecution thing. I do not like Christians talking about being persecuted here in the United States, unless it's I would make an exception for a specialized case, like if there was a Christian in the neighborhood who was constantly being beaten up or harassed, something like that, and that person wants to say they're persecuted, I would not, say, no, you are not. But as a group, while we do face discrimination and rejection, and there's all sorts of issues as far as the culture elites and how they, want to say Christians are mistreated in certain ways in society, I wouldn't argue that. You want to say there's some discrimination, there's some cases where that's clearly the case.
Written a book
about
about
persecution just has a connotation that I just don't feel comfortable with.
Right. Yeah. So the category of oppression then you would say is too severe for what non-white racial groups in the United States experience.
Given our history, I think words mean something. I think when we talk about oppression, we want it to mean something. Oppression was slavery. Oppression was, the internment centers. Oppression was the way the Hispanic people were treated as second-class citizens. Doesn't mean that we don't face discrimination. The research clearly shows African Americans face discrimination still in our society today. That there's not rejection and stigmatization. Sorry. But oppression, I think, has to mean something. And so, yeah, I personally, when I use that word, and other people want to use that word, okay. But I personally, when I use that word for today, because I want to, and I think use that word also gets us away from it forces us to fight the battles that were fought 50 years ago, instead of fighting the battles today. The battles today is not what people see African Americans as not fully human. Very, 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 very few people would have that sort of idea today. That was a more common idea 50 years ago. And so I think we need to deal with the battles today and not 50 years ago. That's why I would not use that word.
Yeah, it's like, there's still this, it's kind of, I know you've been a little bit critical of some of the implicit associations tests and that sort of thing, but there have been some psychologists who have shown that people have an easier time associating darker skinned people with apes.
Yeah.
And a heart, and it's not that they're explicitly thinking these are human people, like people used to think, and people really did think that. But it's that there's this association that's in people's minds still. What are the real world effects of that? I have no idea.
Yeah.
The claim is that's what's lying behind some of the implicit biases and all that kind of stuff. I don't have any idea if
I'm open to the idea that there is this sort of subconscious racial bias a lot of people have. I'm very open to the idea. I just don't think that we have a way of measuring it realistically.
Those
association shows that it has no reliability to it, or very little reliability. I should say no reliability to it, and it's not predictive of actual prejudice. And so, is there maybe one day we'll find out a way we can really measure it? Because I do think that probably does exist. I think that's what explains some of the audit studies that we've seen as far as employment discrimination and such like that. I think that's a better explanation than I'm not going to hire a black guy. I think there's some subconscious. I just don't think. I don't know. How do you measure that? And that's something that's so hard to measure that I'm going to be pretty skeptical unless you can really show me over time that this is a good solid measurement, it's predictive, and it's reliable.
The implicit association tests are instantaneous judgments. That's the thing.
Right. Yeah.
They're how you respond when you're not taking a second to think about it. If you take a second to think about it, you can game those tests. You can get whatever results you want. Take a second. But what you're supposed to be doing is doing it. But it's just that people don't do that.
Yeah.
People take the second and think about it. And that will totally game the test. And that's been demonstrated. So when people take the tests properly, they do seem to have these biases. But what's the real world effect of that? I don't know. In cases where a police officer is making a split-second judgment, maybe that plays a role. Has anyone really correlated that in a way that shows hard data? They've done tests of police officers taking shots at targets and so on. That's about it. I mean, that's the results of those are kind of disturbing. But it's not what people think they are. It's not that they actually police officers do better at that than most people do. Surprisingly.
Well, they have training. I would think that would probably
help. They have training. They have training that helps them with that. So the police officers actually do better than most people at those tests, where they're told to shoot the people who hold guns and not to shoot the ones that have wallets and that kind of thing. And police officers do far better at not shooting the people with wallets than I would or than you would. So, but what they do have, what does affect them, is they're quicker to shoot the ones with guns. If they're black, which means there is an effect. But the effect is in the direction of doing their job more effectively, not less effectively. So now, I mean, that doesn't mean everyone with a gun should be shot, but still, that's what the instructions of the test are. So there's definitely a racial effect. Of thinking being a little bit slightly more. I mean, these test results are not that great. They're not that strong. They're not that. The difference between the people with the bias and the people without the bias, which is none of us, is that what we would be if we didn't have a bias, I guess is what I mean. The difference is not that severe, but the bias that we do have makes it quicker to shoot people who have darker skin if they do have a gun. And it makes it more likely that we'll shoot the person with darker skin if they don't have the gun. And that the second one is not there with cops because it's trained out of them. The first one is not trained out of them. But it means there's some effect going on with stigmatization, negative stereotypes, and so on. But only in these instantaneous cases, as far as we know for sure. The people like the guy that kneeled on George Floyd's neck, that's not implicit associations going on.
Right.
That's something very different in that guy's case.
I mean, I've seen, the studies I've seen have shown that the implicit test doesn't predict prejudice afterwards. But maybe there's certain, but the way research is done is that there may be other sort of studies and maybe they'll be able to refine it over time. And
Yeah,
I'll try to. I'll try to remain open-minded to the implicit bias test over time. If I see more on it that shows, well, it can predict it in this limited way, but the way it's being used, though, is, I think, irresponsible. You have implicit bias, you have all these ranges of prejudice, and that's just simply not true.
Right.
That there are a lot of studies have shown that there's no correlation to showing an implicit bias and being prejudiced in a future task.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now maybe there are some limited tasks. Maybe you're right. Maybe there's maybe we're talking about something that's bang bang, then that kicks in. That's a possibility that I'm willing to entertain, but I'm not willing to entertain the way it's being used by Deangelo and others to sort of imply, hey, there's this. And by the way, and I believe there probably is a subtle type of racial animus that we tend to have, and we don't always know that we have. I just don't think we have a way of measuring it at this point that I trust.
And the thing is with those tests, what was so disturbing about them when they first came out is that it didn't correlate with your actual views. That was why people were saying this is really disturbing. You can be the most progressive, left-wing, anti-racist person, and you take this test and your bias is just as strong, or maybe even stronger than someone who's an actual racist. That's the thing. So it's that was why people found it so disturbing. So the fact that they're activists who are basically taking this research and making it sound like it's showing that this is racism in the more explicit sense is strange to me. So
I think there was probably a psychological desire to expand the definition of racism among these activists. I think that may be why. And once again, it's anti-racism. You find racism everywhere, where it is, but sometimes maybe where it's not. So
and I should say there's all sorts of other ways of doing biases besides these implicit ones, the implicit associations. Implicit associations is just associate this face with this word.
Yeah.
Right. A negative term, a dark face, a negative term, a light face, a positive term, a dark face, a positive term, a light face. Which of those in a split second judgment do you have an easier time doing? That's the implicit associations test. There's all sorts of other biases that are obviously there. I mean, stigmatization is real, and it influences how we think about people. If I see someone who's got a certain skin color, dressed a certain way, walking down the road in a certain way, am I going to expect a certain thing out of that person?
Yeah.
Those are real biases that we have, and those are much more scientifically demonstrated.
Oh yeah, stereotypes has been really demonstrated. Yeah, we stereotype people, and part of it is, and I think this explanation makes sense to me. Part of it is you use the stereotypes as shortcuts because if you have no other information, then you need to, then you use whatever information you have to make an assessment until you get more information. And so, a woman may stereotype men as dangerous because if that's the only thing she knows about someone, and she's in a situation where he might attack her, she must use that information. He's a man, therefore there's this threat is there. Now, once he turns around and he has a white collar, he's a priest or something like that. And now she has further information in order to make a decision. One could even argue that stereotyping is useful to a point. If all you have is certain information and you know that, in fact, there's some interesting research out there that shows that the stereotyping is actually fairly accurate. That we stereotype in ways that they're fairly accurate. I mean, it's not research that's well touted because, as you can imagine, the implications of it. But but I mean, I can direct you to some research right there as far as the problem, of course, stereotyping is that if we set the stereotype, even as we get more information, then it becomes sort of a straitjacket we keep people in. But we all stereotype this to a certain extent when we see individuals, based on the current information that we have of them at the time.
Right. So, for example, if I have a student who is Asian, is it more likely that student grew up speaking a different language at home until they went to school? Yeah. And therefore, should I be looking out for things in their language that I can help them with, right, as they're writing and as I'm reading their papers, right? There doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah.
Stereotyping. but I'm stereotyping in a way that's letting me look out for potential problems that I might be able to help with, right? Whereas when you assume something is true of someone because of their group affiliation, whatever their group might be, when it might not be true, that can be a problem. Maybe just insulting. But in other cases, though, it might be a serious problem. Like if I assume from the outset that I'm going to have low expectations of a student because they're from a demographic that doesn't do as well as, in terms of test scores and grades and so on, then I'm setting my expectations low. That might be a problem because I'm going to then, there'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing, right? Which is why some people do blind grading. I don't, but some people do blind grading to try to avoid that kind of bias.
Sure.
The reason I don't is because I'm reading papers and I want to think about the person as a person when I'm reading their paper. And sometimes that can inform my understanding of their paper. So I think I'm doing them a disservice if I don't know who they are when I'm reading their paper. So it's and I can also take into account, I know this is a student with a disability and that kind of thing. So I don't like to do blind grading for that reason, but I understand why people who do it.
I tend to do blind grading, so I guess I'm one on the other side of it because I don't want to. It's not just about the characteristics. I don't want to give a student a higher grade than they deserve because I mean, let's face facts. Sometimes we like some students more than other students.
Right. So you're soft on them.
And I try to get away from that. But here's what I'll just say. Stereotyping becomes a problem when you're entering into an ongoing relationship with a person and you keep it there. And so if I had a student who came from a marginalized background, I assume that they're not going to do very well. If I maintain that stereotype, that's really problematic. Because I'm not letting that person to demonstrate them to themselves. On the other hand, if I get in an elevator and there's this 6'10" black guy there, and I stereotype him, he probably plays basketball. I leave the elevator. He may not be a basketball player, but okay, so what? I had a stereotype there. That person was in my life for all of 3 seconds and gone. I'm not. My vision of them doesn't really impact them. I mean, it's like, it's an assumption that's not unreasonable to make, but it may not be true. But even if it's not true, so what?
It has no impact.
That's when it's really not problematic. I think to make an initial assessment, we tend to stereotype, but when we hold on to those stereotypes and then just not willing to change them, then it really becomes problematic.
It seems to me that there are realities of race. We need to address those. That's the real problem with colorblindness. And in terms of their anti-racism approach, where you're worried about with them is that they're over-identifying racial problems. They're misassigning them when they're not race issues or when they're not problems. Or that the language that they use is targeting things that are not bad at all, like with whiteness and things like that.
And I think I would also add that they squelch the perspectives of people who disagree with them, especially European Americans. I think that's a real problem. That's not always clear from my unnuanced description of them, but then when you look, dive into their stuff, it becomes pretty clear.
So part of that is a conversational thing, which is your positive approach. You're looking toward collaborative conversations because there's research that just plain shows that that's more effective than the anti-racism kinds of approaches.
There's not research on race per se yet, but there's research in other dimensions. Right, and what I hope to do in the next couple of years is get some research on race.
One of the things you've pointed to is in marriage counseling, right?
Yeah.
So when both parties are involved in the conversation, both parties get to express what they think and and actively listen to the other side.
A good counselor forces you to do that.
Right. So it's so the idea then is this is what you're trying to do research on now, to try to see if it can be demonstrated that this approach works better with race. That's
why I want to do research, because I want to show, because we know that diversity training long term doesn't really work. We know that there is some interesting research showing that in organizations that have mandatory diversity training, you actually have fewer managers of color hired, but if you have voluntary diversity training, you actually have more managers of color hired. So, what is that telling us? I think we have voluntary training. You're probably going to, my guess, is that these are organizations that they're training, because it's voluntary, has to be more conversational. Because if you're going to have a Deangelos sit up there and lecture you for 2 hours, it's voluntary, then most people who aren't already buying anti-racism are going to say, check, please, I'm gone. Right. But it's mandatory, then they have to sort of take it. So I do think that there's evidence out there. Well, the evidence out there, I think, does show that diversity training, the way we tend to do it, does not tend to work, although you can always find exceptions to that. And so, if I can demonstrate then that conversations do work, and contrast that to the evidence that diversity training does not work, then I think that I can make a very strong case that this is the direction we need to go.
So, what do you think about Robin Deangelos' approach is the most good word for it? Harmful?
Yeah.
The most problematic element of her approach.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say which one is the most harmful. Is it shutting down the voices of whites that's the most harmful, or is it telling people of color that you can say anything and white people don't do anything, because humans don't do well having absolute power like that. And the illustration I'd like to give is, what if I as an African American man makes a racialized sexual suggestion to a white woman that I'm working with? Deangelos' approach is that she can't cry, she just has to try to understand. And I've, dehumanized that person. Deangelos makes she never says, here's certain situations where you don't have to take it. No, you have to take it. To me, that's an incredibly dangerous atmosphere that you're going to create.
Does she explicitly say that about a sexual comment?
No. I'm using this example because I'm taking her. She does. What she does not do is say, look,
She doesn't think it.
Here are certain situations where you don't have to do that. She never says that. Right. So if she's not going to say that, then I feel like I could make the argument that, if a black man makes a sexualized, racialized comment, so I'll put the racial in there, so it's not just sexualized. Sexualized comment to a white woman, she has no defenses, because Deangelos gave her no defenses. So I think she owns that, even though she did not say it was okay.
She didn't say, and I think if you presented that case to her, she'd probably say, "Oh no, I don't mean that," because
Then in your book you got to say there are times where you don't have to.
She never says that.
But she doesn't take the time to really think this through. I don't think, to say, look, there are exceptions to this, and clearly lay them out. Because if she does that, then in the world of anti-racism, she's now constraining the voices of people of color.
Right.
But you know what? Our voices need to be constrained because we're human, because of human depravity.
Yeah.
Need to be constrained in helpful ways. Not that we need to be silenced on our opinions, but we need to treat people with respect.
Right.
And that sort of thing. Just like we need to be treated with respect.
And your approach seems to me to capture the idea that she insists on, that voices of color need to be listened to.
Yeah.
You've got that part.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I would not support a perspective where voices of color were shut up, but I will not support a perspective where white voices are shut up, either, because I think that is what we need to have happen.
Right. So the colorblindness approach wants to say your race is irrelevant. It doesn't matter that you're black.
Right. Yeah. So in a way, even though they don't mean to, they shut up voices of color.
Right. And you want to say it does matter that I'm black.
Yeah.
Because that influences me, and not that all black people think alike or that all black people say the same thing, but if race has influenced your experiences and therefore,
then I bring that to the conversation.
Those who don't have those experiences need to hear them to understand what the world is like for someone like you, right? And that's where she's right. She's not wrong about that. But then she says that I don't have any right to say anything because I'm white.
Right. Yeah.
And it's it shuts down the kind of conversation that you want to argue we need to have.
Yeah. It completely shuts it down. And you know, like I said, anti-racism is right when it points out problems. You know, colorblindness is right in certain situations. I'm colorblind when I grade my papers. You know, I don't take into consideration, oh, this person came from a marginalized background, so I'm gonna give them extra points. That would not be fair.
Yeah.
You know,
There was
are there times where we should be colorblind? Yeah, but you know, the total ignoring of our racial backgrounds is what I argue against. And so, you know, I think both of the approaches can find, you know, there are places where they fit. It's just that they become so totalizing that you know, it's sort of like, you know, when you're you're in carpenter, you have a hammer, everything's a nail, and that's just not the way things work out, especially if you can work out with each other.
Yeah. There's a teacher at my kid's school that did that. She was actually giving extra points to the kids of color. And when my kids found out about it, they were truly insulted. They were really upset when they found out about this.
Yeah.
So apparently she got reprimanded for it and was told not to do it anymore, but they didn't fire her over it.
Yeah.
But it just feels insulting, right? And I mean, there is this long tradition of minority voices among minorities who are offended by affirmative action, for example, Clarence.
Right. Yeah.
But this feels much more. I mean, I think a larger percentage of people of color would be offended by that than they would be by affirmative action.
Especially if they're professors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I don't think Deangelo would recommend doing that either.
No, she probably won't. All I'm saying is that, you know, I'm not, just like I don't totally dismiss anti-racism, can't provide some insights, I don't totally dismiss colorblindness either. Even, you know, I'm probably closer to the anti-racist than I am to the colorblindness, but I don't dismiss colorblindness, that there are situations where, yeah, you know, we are going to ignore race in this situation because we're going to do something, what we're trying to accomplish, paying attention to race would actually, you know, if I gave my students of color 10 extra points, so that they're doing better than they think they know than they actually do know, I'm not doing them any favors long term.
Right.
You know, they get better grades than they probably deserve.
Right.
And they probably get jobs, and they you know, if all of us professors did that, not just me, of course, they probably get jobs they're not ready for because they think they know more than they actually do.
Right.
So I need to accurately reflect what they do know on my exams, on the papers, what they need to improve upon. And so, you know, to that degree, yeah, I am colorblind when it comes to grading papers, exams, that sort of stuff. Yeah.
And I think most colorblind people aren't really colorblind when it really, I mean, they a lot of people who would describe themselves as colorblind took great delight in George W. Bush's appointments of Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and right people from various groups that were underrepresented in the highest levels of government. And so it's not that they don't think race should be paid attention to. They just don't like lowering of standards or anything like that.
Yeah.
But then there are the people that I've encountered who think that he shouldn't have been paying attention to those concerns whatsoever.
Yeah. I wonder if some of the people who are kind of colorblind-ish and happy about Condoleezza Rice were happy because they could use that to say, see, Bush is not a racist. You know,
there is that, and it's a similar phenomenon to who's that member of Congress that people always point to on the right, the black woman,
Candace Owens.
Candace Owens, yeah.
Yes.
The phenomenon. Oh, Candace Owens. See, she says she's black, so right. It's almost as if the fact that there's this one black woman that says this making it feel like it's okay that they believe it too.
Yeah.
Right? That really feels wrong to me.
Yeah.
Whether you agree.
Well, I mean, it's the same thing people do with Thomas Sowell. You know, they do the same thing with Thomas Sowell. Now, Thomas Sowell, you know, I think is intellectually above Candace Owens, so I'm not trying
far above her.
I'm not trying to put him in the same category as Candace Owens, but you know, I think he gets a lot more attention and support from conservatives, obviously. If he was a white guy saying the same things, they would still like what he says, but they would not, you know. Sobel is what people put forward when they want to make an economic argument that is more conservative and has a racialized impact.
Race. Yeah. And I mean, he has his blind spots, but I think there's things he just doesn't see, he doesn't understand. He misrepresents things on the left that he doesn't get. But he's polite. He tries to get things right.
Yeah.
And he doesn't try to be over the top, and I think she does. So it comes across as a lot more grating.
Yeah.
And now some of that is also she's a woman and there's stereotypes going on there. But I think and a black woman, right? But some of it is also, I think she's trying to be a firebrand.
Well, that's just a pundit,
right?
I mean, you know how things work in the media. If you're a pundit, the more controversial you are, the more gigs you're going to get, and the more shows you're going to get on. So, I mean, maybe in real life she's not this way at all. Maybe she's, really thoughtful and I don't know. I don't know her personally, so I can't say that she's not that way. Well, I'm not even going to say I doubt she's that way. But when she has the pundit hat on, she can, you sort of get, you're as an academic, you're rewarded for being nuanced and
careful,
understanding, sophistication.
Yeah.
The pundit, the reward system is opposite.
Right. That's true. And Rush Limbaugh always used to say that the personality you would hear on his radio show was put on. It was an act.
Yeah.
He always used to say that he was an actor. And not that he disagreed with the things he was saying, but he was performing.
Right. Yeah.
Always honest about that. I find that refreshing because at least he admitted it.
Yeah.
So you don't see it from actual politicians admitting it. Kendi differs from Deangelo in how he sees racism. Really, that's the main thing. Right?
Yeah.
In my understanding of him, I think you've spent more time looking at his stuff than I have, but my understanding of him, we already talked about there's no non-racism. Yeah. There's anti-racism and there's racism and there's nothing in between. But he also says that racism is, in a sense, race neutral, because anyone can be a racist. And so because he defines racism as any kind of outcome that has disparate effects along race lines.
Right.
So he'll say there are times when he's a racist. What I find from tending from the left really is that they don't like when he says that, because they want to say that black people can't be racists.
Right. Yeah.
Because they've defined racism as power plus privilege.
Yeah.
And when you're not in the position of power, or I mean, even if you're sort of in a small location in a position of power, you're not in the broader culture in a position. So I mean, I've often presented examples like, if I'm in a job interview for a job hiring for philosophy of race, and the person who's doing the interviewing is a black man, I'm definitely the one who's disadvantaged socially in that situation. But it's certainly true that in the broader society, that guy, even though he's in a cushy academic job compared to a lot of black men, and I'm the one who's not, right? I'm teaching as an adjunct faculty member at several institutions. I don't have a full-time job anywhere. And in some ways, he's more privileged than me. But there are some ways that I'm more privileged than him. For example, if I'm driving down the road and a police officer sees me, who's more likely to be stopped? Him. And that can, at least in certain areas anyway. And obviously, if you take that all into account, the question of privilege and power and so on is context relative. But you can think in terms of the big picture, I'm more privileged in some ways than that guy was who interviewed me for a job. And so I'll talk with academics about these things who are on the anti-racism side, and I say, well, you got to be more nuanced about it. And they say, okay, I appreciate your complexity. But, and they'll keep going back to the overall society thing. I think they would say the same thing to you about your research about the ways that Christians are discriminated against in academia. And they would say, yeah, but in greater society, Christians are privileged. And I'm like, well, sure.
Well,
but
the thing that
you're going to acknowledge the other thing that happens, right?
I can tell you the pushback I get on that. And that is, well, look at all the Christian politicians and until last year, Christians elected the president of the United States, and the Christians held the Senate and stuff like that. And so it all defaults back down to political power, which I understand, and political power is power. my argument is that cultural power, Christians are really, they are a classical marginalized group when it comes to cultural power. There's just no doubt about that. And I would argue that cultural power long term is more powerful than political power, because cultural power will equal political power eventually. So yeah, so I that's the pushback that I get on that.
So Hollywood, look at who's
academia,
CEO
media,
positions, right?
the arts. I mean, yeah, you can have your Christian college, but when 99% of the colleges are not Christian and pushing and pushes an ideology that is, if not anti-Christian, at least dismisses Christianity in ways that they would not other religious groups, that's not nothing. But that's sort of push.
And isn't that what I mean? So isn't that what Kendi's saying though? That well, and he's not going that far, but
right, yeah.
Similar point to what I was making about there are certainly ways and places when Christians are not persecuted, but discriminated against, demeaned, and so on. And are there ways that he, as a black man, can do that against white people?
Yeah,
certainly, right?
But I don't think Kendi would make that argument.
You don't think that's what he means when he says
no? I don't think he makes the argument about blacks discriminating against whites. I think he makes the argument that blacks can have attitudes that lead to racism the way that he defines it, which is any inequalities that comes about.
Okay, so he's not actually departing from the power privilege definition that much, then, is he?
He is in this sense. He is in the sense that he says that a black can be racist, even if that black doesn't have power, if that black has an idea or pushes ideas that are racist by his definition of racism.
But it's still only anti-black racism.
Yeah, I don't think
anti-other non-white groups.
Yeah, I've only read his one book, How to Be Anti-Racist. So maybe he did it in his other book. I forget the name of the book now. But he does not ever talk about anti-white racism. And that's because for him, in fact, he actually argues that one of the ways you fight anti-black discrimination is by discrimination, pro-black discrimination, which I would argue is anti-white discrimination.
Yeah.
So he thinks that you can discriminate in order to fight discrimination.
And he doesn't just mean things like affirmative action there, right? He means.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about Kendi, and honestly, in some ways, Kendi is more dangerous than Deangelo. If his ideas got more of a grip, they'd be more dangerous than Deangelo, which is, Deangelo is what I call the therapeutic anti-racism, She probably has certain institutions she wants to change, but hers is, I guess, kind of help black people feel good. Kendi, about his, there's no non-racist.
Right.
Kendi looks at not just racial issues. When we read his book, he talks about, capitalism being a racist institution. He talks about patriarchy as a racist institution. And so he goes down and it's very wide expanding as far as, his ideas of what racism is. And if you depart from that, you're a racist no matter what your race is. The real dangerous part of Kendi is he also advocates that the government gets involved. There should be a department of anti-racism. And if I remember correctly, and I may not have this 100% because it's been a little while since I've read this, but this department would have the power to overturn any laws or rules or regulations, I think at the federal and even at the local levels, that were not sufficiently anti-racist. I mean, the implication of that is astounding. What Kendi would do, Kendi had the power to do this, and if people who buy him, accept this argument, is that we create this incredibly powerful department that would basically be busy implementing the ideas that he argues are anti-racism. I mean, literally taking over the government to push. And remember, anti-racism is not just about race. And Kendi's,
right.
It's also about capitalism. It's also about patriarchy. It's also about, issues of sexuality. He ties all those into anti-racism as well. So, so that's why I actually say Kendi is more dangerous than Deangelo. If out of as bad as she is, and her stuff is horrible, I'd rather people go to her than go to him because the implications of what he really wants it's this tremendous power grab.
It's Plato's Republic level totalitarianism.
I don't know. I've never read
Plato's Republic. You
so
find
I'll
the
just have
ideal
to-
perfect ruler. You put them in charge, and they get to say everything. There's no laws that constrain them. That's,
Well, I have heard the argument that the best type of government would be a benevolent dictator.
well, I
And
think
in
that's
theory,
true. I mean, I think
in
any
theory
Christian
that's
would believe
true.
that.
The problem is what happens when that person dies.
Right.
You know?
Any Christian should believe that, but there's only one perfect ruler, and that's Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
For a human government, you just can't do that. And Plato himself, in the Republic, he presents
Yeah.
this, but then in a later work, he says there's no way we could ever do it, and we shouldn't even try because it's too dangerous. You put the wrong person in there, you give them absolute power. It's absolutely disastrous. And,
exactly. Or you pick the right person. Eventually, the wrong person is going to get in there.
Right. Yeah.
Even if you get a dictator, you set up a dictatorship, and that person is going to die, or something's going to happen to that person, and then someone's going to move in. And how do you make sure that person is always a good person? I think the way we are, there's no way we can make sure. And so that's why, in theory, that's great. I mean, in theory, sometimes I said, couldn't we just now have this great dictator to make all these decisions for us? Someone who really wants our well-being. I mean, Confucianism talks about, having a government that's going to create better people and stuff like that. And I say, wouldn't that be great? But then the reality strikes me, even if you found that person and you put them in that position, what's going to happen when that person dies? So that's why Kennedy are really quite dangerous. I probably, if I had the time, I probably should do a treatment of him like I did with Deangelos with my blog. But I just don't have the time to do that. I mean, but yeah, I really am concerned. If I think, I think at some point, if he got popular enough to really start getting some sort of power, something would stop him from implementing this very dangerous idea of this Department of Antiracism. But still, the fact that he has that and people still follow him should be disturbing to us.
Is that in his book, or is that just stuff?
That's in the book. Yes.
Okay, because I know he's been made.
Yeah, I got that from the book.
I didn't know it was actually in the book. Do you talk about this stuff in your forthcoming book?
I don't know if I critique Kendi that to that, because I'm trying to look at more of a generalized anti-racism rather than critique individuals. So you critique the individual, then someone says, "Well, I don't buy that. I don't buy that Department of Anti-Racism. I buy this other stuff." So I think I try to deal more with more generality.
What you talk about is definition of racism.
And also when you critique individuals, people always have the out, well, you just got an extreme person. And so, that's why I rather critique the general ideas rather than individuals.
But you do mention him and Deangelo in the book and talk
about I mentioned them, yes. Yeah, I mean, they're going to get a couple of citations when my book comes out from me. So
yeah,
not that they need them.
More on the popular mindset, I guess.
Because I mean, look, there were 1 and 2 bestsellers in Amazon for how long? I mean, how can you ignore them? Talk about anti-racism.
Well, I look forward to your book when it comes out. Do you have the other one that I haven't read yet? I still want to get to the one that focuses on Christian communities, and really looking forward to that. I had to read the secular argument version of that when I probably would have preferred to read that one first, since they were written in that order.
Yeah.
I'm several other stuff that you've done. Your stuff on discrimination against conservatives in the academy and discrimination against Christians in the academy, I think is worthy of attention. And maybe at some point it would be good to have you back and have a conversation about that stuff at some point.
Sounds good.
Thank you for doing this.
Okay. Thanks for having me, and I guess you're going to head off to class soon, so have a good class.
Yeah. You've been listening to the Parableman podcast, or watching, depending on whether you're doing the video version or the audio version. And my guest today was George Yancey, and we had a good conversation about race and his collaborative approach, in distinction to a collaborative conversations approach, in distinction from what he's calling the colorblindness approach and the anti-racism approach. So I will sign off now, and look forward to maybe having another conversation with him on another occasion.